a look at weight, centre of gravity, and how these things relate to stability. So the first thing is to look at the equation for weight, which is W equals mg. If you notice, this is basically the same as the F equals ma equation, mass times acceleration, where gravity is the acceleration due to gravity, or sometimes called gravitational field strength. They're both 9.81, and remember, as you've already met, they have slightly different units that are identical. So what do we mean by centre of gravity and stability? So the object on the left is stable. It has points of contact with the ground, which extend all across the base there. The centre of gravity is within that base, so it's not going to move. It's not going to tip. It's not going to fall over. This is a stable position. In the second instance, what we've done here is we've applied a force. Now, where the old base was, the centre of gravity is within that base, so when this falls, it will fall back to where it started. But its actual support point here is now just this corner. And it isn't quite on that corner, so it is going to fall, and it is not, obviously not in a stable point, it's going to fall back. But the point is it will return back to its original position. In the third instance, we're applying a larger force, and that has managed to tip the box past this corner support here. So now it will fall over. It won't return back to its original position. So it's highly unstable. What we could do is put this box on its corner, but that would be a position of instability because it would require, well, it would have to be very exact. It's unlikely to stay. And the smallest of forces would move the centre of gravity off this tiny base. So tiny bases, tiny contact points with the floor are very unstable because the centre of gravity doesn't have to move very far for it to leave its centre of support and fall over. Okay, so the object on the left, it will move if you apply a force to the top of it, but it will return to its original position pretty easily. And you've got to apply a very large force in order for it to actually tip over. An object balancing on its point would only need a very tiny force to make it fall over one way or the other. Now, people are obviously a lot more complicated than boxes because they have joints and their centre of mass is a little bit more difficult to locate, but it's generally around about your lower torso. But if you can understand the way that we can use centre of gravity and points of stability, we can start to see how people could use centre of mass and points of stability to make themselves more stable or to be able to move around. Let's take a look. So just to understand a little bit more about centre of gravity, this little toy has a very low centre of gravity. Now, it only ever really has a tiny point of contact because it's got a round bottom. But in terms of something returning back to its original point, it has to be pushed quite a distance over to not return. That's partly down to the fact that it's got a round bottom. But it does also demonstrate the level of stability given by lower centres of mass. So a low centre of mass or low centre of gravity, just consider in those three circumstances. Obviously, the first on the left is stable. The second, the line of centre of gravity is that side of the green contact point. So this would fall back to where it was when that force was removed. But even the third diagram on the far right, the centre of gravity is still this side of the contact point. So even this box would fall back to where it started when that force is released. You'd have to have a very big force to push this all the way over. So a low centre of gravity can make an object potentially more stable or more able to return to where it started. So imagine that you're perhaps in a situation, I don't know, in an earthquake. The ground is shaking and you want to try and not fall over. One of the things you might do is crouch down. Literally what you're doing is lowering your centre of gravity compared to your stability base. And that does increase your stability or ability to not be knocked off your feet. So with a person, the centre of gravity can change slightly depending on where your arms are. So it's no great surprise if you stick your arms out forwards, your centre of gravity can change a little bit. It moves up, it moves backwards, it moves forwards, it moves down. So when you're dancing or moving around, any kind of motion of limbs can move your centre of gravity. And if your feet aren't placed correctly, that can move your centre of gravity slightly outside of your base, which means you're going to fall over. This is where you'll hear in a lot of sports like martial arts, particularly things like fencing, that footwork is key. Keeping the footwork correct, for want of a better explanation, means that quite often you're keeping your centre of gravity within your realm of control. So you have your body and your body mass under control at any given point. But it is also just interesting to note that on some cases, and we'll look at a use of this in a second, in certain body shapes, the centre of gravity can be technically outside of the body. Okay, so let's just take a person, which is apparently a completely inflexible person. It doesn't take a person very much movement. If you just look at where the little X is at the bottom here, to move their centre of gravity outside of their kind of base of stability, which is essentially your feet. And your feet aren't very big. So you can spread your legs further apart, and that gives you side-to-side stability, but your backwards and forward stability is less good. So you could more easily push somebody over from the front or the back than you could try and push them over sideways, unless they're standing with their feet really close together. Interestingly, this is how we move. By controlling our centre of gravity and its position, we're able to do very simple things like walk. Imagine a third diagram here, where this person just put out one of their legs. Now that centre of gravity is back in the base of control, but the whole body on average has started to move forwards. Now if they were to bring this leg forwards and effectively go back into this position, they would be back falling again, but they could put out the other leg and save themselves. This is effectively how we walk. To start walking, we push off the back leg, but we also lean our body weight forwards a little bit and we fall. And we just put a leg out to catch ourselves, and then we use our momentum to keep moving. We put out another leg to catch ourselves. It seems a really strange way of thinking about walking, but actually what you're doing is just falling forwards in a controlled fashion constantly. It's also why when you start running, you might see that people generally lean forwards a little bit more, but more on that in just a second. So let's just consider that thought. Here's a sprinter. Now, they're just coming out of the blocks, and one thing they're doing here is accelerating. Their centre of mass is going to be around about here, but their points of contact with the floor, well, the moment is there, but at best is here if we consider all of their feet. They are unstable, and they are falling forwards. But a sprinter uses that falling motion to gain a lot of forwards acceleration. If this person remained upright and just pushed hard off this left leg, they'd move forwards, but what would happen if you think of the giraffe back in Newton's first law is this part of the body would want to remain still, while the part where the force was being applied would go that way. The end result would be, well, not good. So the person leans forwards as a way to create a sort of strange type of stability, but they use their instability and control it in order to accelerate forwards. So this is why sprinters come out of the blocks, because they can effectively lift their arms, fall forwards, and use their legs to catch up with their falling body. By the time they get to being more upright, they've usually reached their maximum speed and their centre of mass is back over their legs, their feet, and that base of stability again. Similarly, for something like a cyclist, but the same is true if you watch runners going around the corner on a track. They will lean slightly. And partly what we're doing here is if the cyclist was to turn left without leaning, their centre of mass would be here. That's okay, that's a force pulling down. But the bottom of the bike would go that way, but this part of the cyclist would try and stay still and they'd actually fall over. Partly this comes into a little bit of circular motion, which you'll look at later on. But it is interesting just to look at how we do use and control our centre of mass. And here's one last way. You've probably heard of the Fosbury flop if you're into athletics. So this is the technique that most people use now to do high jump. And the reason why people can jump so high, and couldn't before this technique was invented, is because the shape of the person puts the majority of their mass in a kind of C-shaped distribution. And the centre of all of that mass is actually here. So the centre of gravity can pass under the bar. It isn't possible quite often to get your entire mass over the bar, but your centre of mass can pass just under it without actually any part of your body passing under it. So there's an interesting way of using centre of mass in an athletic context to get your body to do things that it shouldn't technically be able to do. All down to physics. See, told you physics is awesome.